Consider a question that does not have a clean answer. What if there was a period in recorded history, not ancient myth, not folklore, but a documented period within the last 200 years when massive human remains were being discovered across an entire continent? Not in one place, not as a single event, but repeatedly in different locations, spanning different decades, reported by different people who had no particular reason to coordinate their accounts. And then, slowly, something happened to those reports. Not all at once. Gradually, the physical remains became harder to locate. The institutional records became thinner. The newspaper accounts, once numerous, stopped appearing. The official acknowledgments, where they had existed, quietly faded. And what was left behind was a gap, a space in the historical record that does not fully explain itself. This is where the story begins, not with a single dramatic discovery, but with a pattern of findings, a pattern of silence, and a growing set of questions that become harder to answer the more closely they are examined. In the 1800s, newspapers across the United States published accounts of giant human skeletal remains being unearthed from the ground. This was not an occasional curiosity. The reports were spread across decades, appearing in papers from different states, filed by correspondents in different regions. Some described remains measuring over 7 feet in height. Others reported figures approaching 8 feet. A smaller number of accounts described measurements that went even beyond that. The papers publishing these accounts were not, for the most part, sensationalist publications operating on the margins of credibility. Several were established regional newspapers with regular readerships, consistent editorial standards, and reputations built over years of coverage. This raises an immediate question. If the reports were fabricated or wildly inaccurate, why did credible publications repeat them? And why did those same publications not, in many cases, later issue corrections or retractions? At first, this might seem like a straightforward matter of historical record-keeping. 19th century journalism was imperfect. Standards were different. Errors were made, and sometimes never corrected. That explanation is reasonable, as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. Because the problem is not simply that individual reports contained errors. The problem is what happened to the broader body of evidence over time, and what that pattern of disappearance might or might not mean. If dozens of credible newspapers published accounts of unusual skeletal remains, and if even a fraction of those accounts reflected actual discoveries, then there should be some physical evidence remaining. There should be bones in museum collections. There should be preserved specimens in university archives or research institutions. There should be photographs, even early ones, that survived. There should be field notes, correspondence, cataloging records, the kinds of materials that tend to accumulate around any significant archaeological discovery, however old it may be. But this is where it becomes unclear. When researchers attempt to follow the chain of evidence from the newspaper reports to physical specimens, the trail frequently goes cold. Objects described as having been sent to institutions either cannot be located or are not acknowledged as part of those institutions' collections. Photographs referenced in accounts do not surface in archives. Field records that should accompany any serious excavation are, in many cases, simply absent. This does not necessarily mean the discoveries never happened. The absence of surviving evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Records are lost. Objects are misplaced or mislabeled. Archives are incomplete. Institutions change priorities, reorganize collections, or discard material deemed irrelevant. These are all real and documented phenomena in the history of physical collections. But even accounting for all of that, the scale of the absence in this particular case is difficult to explain in ordinary terms. Some researchers and historians who have looked at this subject point to a more specific problem. They note that in several documented cases, skeletal remains were reportedly removed from excavation sites and transported to institutions, and then, at that point, the record ends. Not the institution's general record, the record of those specific objects. They arrived, or were said to have arrived, and then they cannot be accounted for. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A pattern of objects entering collections and then becoming untraceable is not the same as random archival loss. It is a particular kind of disappearance. Now, there are multiple possible explanations for this. One is simply that the original newspaper reports were exaggerated or inaccurate, that the remains in question were not as unusual as described, and that once examined by professionals, they were correctly identified as ordinary skeletal material and cataloged without any special distinction. Under that explanation, the mystery largely disappears because there was never anything unusual to preserve. However, even this explanation runs into a problem. If the remains were examined, identified, and cataloged, then that process should have left a record of its own. The examination, the identification, the cataloging, all of it should appear somewhere. Others have suggested a different explanation. They propose that the remains were, in fact, unusual, and that at some point a decision was made, by institutions, by researchers, or by some combination of both, to limit or suppress the circulation of information about them. This explanation is more controversial, and it requires a much higher level of evidence to support. Extraordinary claims of deliberate suppression require specific documentation. Who made the decision? When? Under what authority? And to what end? That documentation, if it exists, has not been made publicly available in any verifiable form. So that particular explanation remains, at this point, more of a hypothesis than a demonstrated fact. What can be said with more confidence is this: the mainstream archaeological record does not include these discoveries. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is simply an observable fact about the current state of the record. Whatever was found in those excavations, whether the remains were ordinary or extraordinary, they did not enter the standard body of documented archaeological evidence in any way that is now publicly accessible or formally acknowledged. And that gap, regardless of its cause, is real. It is also worth noting that the geographical spread of the original reports is significant. These accounts came from locations across a wide portion of the country, from the Midwest, from the Eastern Seaboard, from the Great Lakes region, from the South. They were not concentrated in a single area that might be explained by local geological or cultural conditions. The distribution suggests, at minimum, that whatever people were finding and reporting was not isolated to one site or one moment. Whether those finds were accurately described is a separate question, but the geographic spread of the reporting itself is not easily dismissed as coincidence. The timeline of the reports is also worth examining. The accounts appear frequently through much of the 19th century, and then they begin to thin out. By the early 20th century, this type of reporting had become notably less common. That shift in the pattern coincides, broadly, with the formalization of American archaeology as a professional discipline. New institutions were being established. New standards were being developed. The field was moving from a loose collection of amateur excavations and informal reporting toward something more structured and more controlled. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because that transition had both positive and negative effects on the historical record. On the positive side, it brought greater rigor to excavation practices, better preservation methods, and more systematic documentation. On the more complicated side, it also concentrated decision-making about what counted as significant within a smaller group of institutions and individuals. And any system that concentrates decision-making also, by definition, concentrates the power to include or exclude particular findings from the official record. None of this proves that anything was deliberately hidden, but it does suggest that the shift in the record does not require a dramatic explanation. The change in reporting patterns could reflect a change in who was doing the reporting and who was deciding what to publish, rather than necessarily reflecting a change in what was actually being found in the ground. And yet the question of physical evidence does not go away. If remains were recovered, documented in newspapers, and transported to institutions, then something physical was involved. Physical objects, unlike editorial policies, do not simply dissolve. They can be destroyed, lost, or deliberately removed from circulation, but each of those outcomes leaves its own kind of trace. And in this case, those traces are not clearly visible either. So the picture that emerges from looking at this subject carefully is one of genuine uncertainty. The newspaper accounts exist. They are real documents, printed in real publications, preserved in archives and digitized collections where anyone can read them. The absence of physical evidence is also real. The gap between what was reported and what can be verified today is real. What is not clear, and what remains genuinely unresolved, is the explanation that connects those facts. Some who study the subject are convinced that the gap reflects something significant, that the scale of the reporting, combined with the scale of the absence, points toward a story that has not been fully told. Others look at the same evidence and conclude that the most straightforward explanation is probably correct, that 19th century journalism was unreliable, that amateur excavations were poorly documented, and that what appeared in newspapers reflected a combination of real but misidentified finds, honest exaggeration, and occasional outright fiction. Both positions are held by people who have looked at the available evidence seriously, and neither position can be fully proven or fully dismissed on the basis of what currently exists in the public record. That is precisely what makes this subject worth examining, not because the answer is obvious, but because the question itself has not been satisfactorily closed. The further back you trace the story, the more complicated it becomes. Each layer of the record raises new questions about the layer beneath it, and somewhere in that accumulation of old newspaper pages, missing specimens, incomplete archives, and unanswered institutional inquiries, there may be something more definite waiting to be found, or there may not be. That uncertainty is not a comfortable place to leave things, but it may be the most honest one. When something unusual appears in the historical record, the first reasonable step is to look for the simplest explanation. And in the case of the giant skeleton reports from the 1800s, there's a standard explanation, one that comes from historians, archaeologists, and institutions with long-standing credibility in their respective fields. It is worth understanding that explanation carefully before asking whether it fully accounts for everything. The official position, stated plainly, is this: the reports were not accurate. The giant skeletons described in 19th century newspapers were, according to mainstream scholarship, the product of misidentification, exaggeration, or in some cases outright fabrication. This is not a fringe dismissal. It is the considered position of professional researchers who have studied the archaeology of North America across many decades. And to be fair to that position, it rests on several observations that are genuinely reasonable. The first observation concerns the nature of journalism in the 1800s. Reporting during that period operated under conditions that were significantly different from what we now expect from credible news sources. There were no standardized verification processes. Editors did not routinely send correspondents into the field to independently confirm the claims being made. Stories were frequently based on second-hand accounts, local hearsay, or the word of a single individual who may or may not have been in a position to accurately assess what they had seen. In that environment, errors were not just possible, they were common. There's also a broader journalistic pattern from that era that historians have documented in some detail. It is often referred to informally as yellow journalism, a term used to describe a style of reporting that prioritized sensation over accuracy. Publications were competing for readers in a crowded marketplace. Dramatic stories sold copies. A report about an enormous skeleton found in a field was exactly the kind of account that would attract attention, generate conversation, and move papers off the press. That commercial incentive existed alongside whatever factual obligation editors may have felt, and in many documented cases it won. This does not mean that every unusual report from the 1800s was fabricated, but it does mean that the mere existence of a newspaper account is not, by itself, strong evidence that the event described actually occurred in the way described. That point is fair, and it applies to many categories of historical reporting from the same period, not just archaeology. The second part of the standard explanation concerns what happens to human remains over long periods of burial. This is where the science becomes relevant. Bones do not stay perfectly preserved in the ground. They change, depending on the chemical composition of the surrounding soil, the moisture levels, the temperature fluctuations over centuries, and the pressure exerted by layers of earth above them. Skeletal remains can shift, expand, compress, fragment, or fuse in ways that alter their apparent proportions significantly. An untrained observer encountering a set of remains that have been in the ground for several hundred years might reasonably misjudge their original dimensions. Bones that appear elongated may have expanded due to mineral absorption. A skull that looks unusually large may have been distorted by soil pressure. Limb bones found scattered and out of their original anatomical position might be mentally reassembled incorrectly, producing an impression of greater overall height than the individual actually had in life. Experts point out that this kind of misinterpretation is not a sign of dishonesty. It is simply a predictable outcome of asking someone without specialist training to assess skeletal material under field conditions. At first, this explanation seems entirely plausible, and in many individual cases, it probably is the right explanation. The question is whether it is sufficient to account for all of the reports, across all of the locations, all of the decades, and involving all of the different individuals who claim to have made or witnessed these discoveries. Some researchers believe it is. Others are less certain. The third element of the official account involves the Smithsonian Institution specifically. The Smithsonian is mentioned frequently in discussions of this subject, and for understandable reasons. It is one of the oldest and most prominent research and collection institutions in the United States. Its Bureau of Ethnology was actively involved in archaeological fieldwork across North America during the latter half of the 19th century. If unusual skeletal remains had been found and formally collected during that period, the Smithsonian would be among the most likely places for them to have ended up. The institution's official position has been stated clearly. The Smithsonian holds no record of giant human skeletons being collected, held, and then hidden or deliberately destroyed. According to that position, the question of what happened to the remains is not a real question, because the remains, in the form described in the newspaper accounts, never existed in the first place. The reports, in the institution's view, do not reflect real discoveries of genuinely unusual skeletal material. They reflect the journalistic and cultural environment of the time, a period when unusual stories circulated freely, when verification was rare, and when the public appetite for the strange and extraordinary was significant. That is a coherent position. It is internally consistent, and it draws on real knowledge of how archaeology, journalism, and institutional record-keeping actually work. But this is where things start to become uncertain, because a coherent explanation is not automatically a complete one. There are specific aspects of the historical record that the standard explanation handles less cleanly than others. One of them involves the sheer volume of reports. Misidentification, exaggeration, and fabrication can account for some accounts. They can even account for many. But when the same general phenomenon, large skeletal remains being found, is reported across different decades, in geographically separate locations, by people with no apparent connection to one another, the quantity of the reporting begins to require its own explanation. A single fabricated story can be explained as opportunism. A handful can be explained as imitation. One report inspiring others to produce similar accounts for similar commercial reasons. But when the reports number in the dozens and span the better part of a century, the explanation that each one was independently invented or independently mistaken becomes somewhat harder to sustain without additional evidence. That does not mean the alternative, that all the reports were accurate, is correct. It means the explanation needs to account for the volume, not just the individual cases. Another area where the explanation becomes difficult involves the accounts that include specific, verifiable details. Not all of the 19th century reports were vague. Some included named individuals who claimed to have made or witnessed the discoveries. Some included location descriptions specific enough to be cross-referenced with known geographical records. Some referenced institutions or individuals in ways that, in principle, could be checked. If these specific accounts were fabrications, then the people named in them either never existed, or they existed and did not actually make the claims attributed to them, or they made the claims and were lying. Each of those possibilities has different implications for the standard explanation, and in cases where researchers have attempted to follow up on the specific details, to locate the named individuals, to verify the locations, to find the institutions mentioned, the results have not been uniformly clear. Some details have not checked out. Others have proven harder to disprove than might be expected if the accounts were straightforward inventions. The Smithsonian's official denial is also worth examining on its own terms. The institution's statement that it holds no record of such remains is meaningful, but it has a specific scope. It describes what the Smithsonian's current accessible records show. It does not and cannot account for everything that was collected, transferred, lost, or discarded over more than a century and a half of institutional history. Large institutions accumulate vast quantities of material. Not everything that enters a collection remains cataloged in a continuously accessible form. Records are reorganized, consolidated, or in some cases simply lost during transitions between staff, systems, or physical storage locations. This is not a suggestion that the Smithsonian is concealing anything. It is an observation that institutional record-keeping, even in well-resourced organizations, has limits. The absence of a current accessible record is not the same as a guarantee that no such material ever existed within the institution's holdings. That distinction is not a minor one. It determines whether the official denial fully closes the question, or whether it leaves a gap that the existing evidence does not yet fill. There is also a question that the standard explanation tends not to address directly. Why did the pattern of reporting end when it did? If the accounts from the 1800s were primarily the product of journalistic sensationalism, one might expect some version of that sensationalism to have continued in modified form into the 20th century. Sensational journalism did not disappear. The appetite for unusual stories did not disappear. But this particular category of report, the discovery of giant human remains, did largely disappear from mainstream coverage, and it did so in a relatively short window of time. Some researchers suggest that the disappearance of the reports is consistent with the standard explanation. As archaeology became more professionalized and standards rose, stories that would not survive scrutiny simply stopped being published. That is a reasonable argument, but it does not fully explain why accounts that were supposedly based on real misidentifications also stopped appearing. If bones were still being found and still being misread by untrained observers, some reporting of those encounters might be expected to continue, even if the reporting was more carefully filtered by editors aware of the new professional standards in the field. What the official explanation offers, ultimately, is a framework that accounts for a large portion of the available evidence in a logical and credible way. Yellow journalism was real. Bone misidentification by untrained observers was real. The commercial pressures that led editors to publish unverified stories were real. These are not invented defenses. They are documented historical phenomena with well-established effects on the quality of 19th century public information. The framework that accounts for a large portion of the evidence is not the same as a framework that accounts for all of it. And in the specific details of this subject, the volume of the reports, the cases with named individuals and specific locations, the gap between what was reportedly collected and what is currently traceable, there remain points that the standard explanation does not resolve with complete clarity. Whether those unresolved points represent something significant or whether they are simply the ordinary residue of imperfect historical records, is a question that continues to sit without a definitive answer. The official record says the skeletons were never real. The newspaper record says something was being found and reported, repeatedly, across a wide geography and a long span of time. Somewhere between those two positions is the actual history of what happened, and at this point, that history has not been fully reconstructed in a way that satisfies both sides of the question. There is a useful test that can be applied to historical accounts when trying to determine how seriously to take them. It is not a perfect test, and it does not produce definitive answers on its own, but it is informative. The test is this: does the account behave like a fabrication, or does it behave like a report of something that actually happened? Fabricated stories tend to follow recognizable patterns. They are often vague in the details that would be easiest to verify. They favor round numbers over specific measurements. They rely on anonymous sources rather than named individuals. They describe events in general terms that are difficult to cross-reference with other records. They do not include the kinds of incidental, mundane details that appear naturally in genuine accounts. The name of the field, the time of year, the occupation of the person who made the find. Those specifics are the texture of real events. Invented stories frequently lack them because they are unnecessary for the story to function, and including them creates opportunities for contradiction. When this test is applied to the giant skeleton reports from the 1800s, something worth noting emerges. Not all of the accounts behave like fabrications. Some of the newspaper reports from that period included a level of specific detail that does not fit neatly with the profile of a straightforward invented story. They named the landowners on whose property the remains were found. They named the workers, laborers, farmhands, men digging for various practical purposes, who first encountered the bones. They named local officials, who were reported to have been present at the site. They named doctors or other community figures, who were said to have examined the remains. And in a number of cases, they included specific measurements. Not rounded figures like 7 feet or 8 feet, but precise numbers that suggested someone had actually taken a measurement and recorded it. None of this confirms that the skeletons were genuine, or that they were as unusual as described. That point is important to keep clear. Specific details can still be wrong. Names can be borrowed from real people and attached to events those people had no part in. Measurements can be taken incorrectly or reported inaccurately. Precision in a story does not automatically guarantee accuracy, but it does change the nature of the question being asked. Because if these accounts were purely invented, if a writer sat down and constructed a story about a giant skeleton with no basis in real events, then the decision to include the names of real local people is a peculiar one. A fabricator working in a small regional community would know that their readers might personally recognize the individuals named. They would know that those individuals could deny the account, or that neighbors and acquaintances could ask them about it directly. Including real names in a fabricated story is not impossible, but it is a risk that a careful inventor would have reason to avoid. And yet the names appear repeatedly across different reports and different locations. One explanation for this is that the names were genuine but the events around them were not. Under this reading, a writer took the name of a real landowner or a real local figure and built a fictional story around that name to give it a sense of authenticity. The person named might not have objected, or might not have had a practical way to issue a correction, or might have been amused or even pleased by the attention. This kind of embellishment was not unheard of in 19th century journalism. It is a real possibility, and it should not be dismissed. A second explanation is that something real did happen, but the reporting of it was inaccurate in the details that matter most. Local excitement about an unusual find could easily lead to exaggerated measurements. A set of remains that was genuinely old and in unusual condition might have looked strange to the people who found it. The doctor or official who examined it might have offered a rough assessment that was then reported with more confidence than it deserved. Under this explanation, the bones were real, the people were real, but the interpretation of what was found was distorted in the process of being reported. This is also a genuine possibility, and it is consistent with what is known about how information travels and changes in close-knit communities without reliable fact-checking. But there is a third possibility, one that neither of the previous two explanations fully addresses, and one that historians have been less direct in examining. It is the possibility that some of these discoveries were real, that the remains were genuinely unusual in some way, that the people named in the reports actually witnessed what was described, and that despite all of that, nothing formally happened afterward. No collection, no institutional follow-up, no archaeological record. The discovery simply occurred and then was not pursued. That gap between discovery and follow-up is the part of the story that is hardest to explain cleanly. In the standard account of how unusual archaeological finds are supposed to work, a credible discovery of significant remains should generate professional interest. It should bring trained individuals to the site. It should result in the remains being examined, documented, and entered into some kind of record. Even in the 1800s, when archaeology was less formalized than it later became, there were institutions and individuals actively seeking out unusual finds. Reports of significant skeletal remains were, in principle, exactly the kind of information those institutions were interested in receiving. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because in a number of the cases where specific details were provided, named individuals, named locations, described dimensions, there is no clear evidence that any formal follow-up took place. The discovery was reported, and then, in the available record, nothing more happened. No institution arrived. No further examination was recorded. The site was not revisited in any documented way. The remains, whatever they were, do not appear to have entered any known collection. At first, this might seem easily explainable. Communication was slow in the 19th century. Institutions were not always aware of regional newspaper reports. Local landowners might not have preserved the remains or made them available for examination. A discovery that occurred during the planting or harvesting season might have been set aside for practical reasons and then forgotten. These are all real factors that affected how information and objects moved through that period. They are not invented obstacles. They reflect genuine constraints of the time. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation in every case. Some of the reports appeared in papers with regional or even national circulation. Some described finds in areas that were already being actively surveyed by researchers with institutional affiliations. In those cases, the argument that no one with relevant expertise was aware of the discovery becomes harder to sustain. If the report reached a wide audience, and if people with the training and the institutional resources to investigate were among that audience, the absence of any documented follow-up requires an explanation of its own. That detail sounds minor at first, the question of why no one followed up, but it is not a minor detail. Follow-up is what separates a discovery from a rumor. It is what separates an account in a newspaper from an entry in a scientific record. The absence of follow-up consistently across multiple reported discoveries with specific details and named individuals is a pattern. And patterns of absence are just as meaningful as patterns of presence, even if they are harder to interpret. There is a particular type of historical silence that appears around certain subjects, not a silence that results from records being lost or destroyed, but a silence that appears to have been present from the beginning. No record was ever made. No institution was ever contacted. No follow-up was ever initiated. This kind of original silence is different from archival loss, and it is more difficult to explain through ordinary means. Whether that is what is happening here is not certain, but it is worth asking whether the consistent absence of follow-up reflects indifference, oversight, or something else that the available record does not clearly identify. One angle worth examining is the social and professional context in which these discoveries were reported. Many of the finds described in the newspaper accounts were made by ordinary working people, laborers digging foundations, farmers turning fields, workers excavating for practical construction purposes. These were not people with professional standing in the emerging field of archaeology. They had no institutional connections. They had no mechanism for formally reporting a discovery to a research body, and in many cases they may not have known such a mechanism existed. A find that began with a laborer and was reported by a local journalist might never have reached the desk of anyone with the authority or the inclination to pursue it further. This context is important because it shifts the nature of the gap slightly. If the discoveries were not followed up, it may not be because someone decided not to follow up on them. It may be because the path from discovery to institution was never completed, because the people who made the finds had no means of completing it, and the people who read about the finds had no particular reason to act on them. That is a structural explanation rather than a conspiratorial one, and it deserves serious consideration. At the same time, it does not account for every case. In some of the accounts, the involvement of local professionals, doctors, officials, educated observers, suggests that the discovery did reach people with some standing and some awareness of what a significant find might mean. In those cases, the absence of follow-up is less easily explained by structural barriers alone. Someone with professional knowledge was reportedly present, and still nothing formal appears to have resulted from it. This is where the cracks in the simple explanation become visible, not as proof of anything more dramatic, not as confirmation that something was deliberately concealed, but as a sign that the standard account, fabrication, exaggeration, misidentification, does not sit perfectly over all of the available evidence. Some of the reports behave differently from what pure invention would predict. Some of the details are of a kind that a fabricator would have reason to avoid, and some of the gaps in the follow-up record are of a kind that ordinary structural explanations do not fully resolve. What this means, in practical terms, is that the question remains open in a way that the official position tends not to acknowledge. Not open in the sense of pointing clearly toward any particular alternative, but open in the sense that the evidence does not fully support a single, clean explanation for all of the accounts, across all of the locations, involving all of the named individuals and specific measurements that appear in the historical record. The cracks are not large. They are not, on their own, conclusive, but they are present, and they are consistent enough across enough different cases that they are worth examining carefully before moving on to the next layer of the story. To make sense of why giant skeleton reports appeared so frequently across American newspapers in the 1800s, it is necessary to step back from the individual accounts and look at the broader conditions that surrounded them. The reports did not emerge in a vacuum. They appeared at a particular moment in history, a moment defined by rapid physical change across the continent, intense public curiosity about the past, and a set of cultural beliefs that were actively shaping how new discoveries were being interpreted. Understanding that context does not settle the question of whether the reports were accurate, but it makes the question considerably easier to examine. The most immediate factor is a straightforward one. The 19th century was a period of extraordinary land disturbance across North America. Settlement was moving westward at a pace that had no real historical precedent on the continent. Forests were being cleared. Prairies were being broken for agriculture. Rivers were being redirected or bridged. Canals were being dug. Roads and rail lines were cutting through terrain that had remained largely undisturbed for centuries. Towns were being built where no structures had previously stood. And all of this activity required one thing above everything else: moving large quantities of earth. When soil that has been undisturbed for a long period is opened on a wide scale, what is in that soil begins to come to the surface. And across a significant portion of North America, particularly in the Midwest and the eastern regions of what would become the United States, what was in the soil included a remarkable and largely unexplored archaeological record: burial mounds, earthworks, ceremonial sites, and human remains, in quantities and states of preservation that the people doing the digging had rarely encountered before and had no established framework for understanding. The burial mounds, in particular, were impossible to miss. They were visible features of the landscape, raised formations of earth that interrupted otherwise flat or gently rolling terrain. Some were modest in size. Others were considerably larger, rising several feet above the surrounding ground and extending over areas that required real effort to construct. They appeared across a wide geographic range, along river valleys, on elevated ground near water sources, clustered in groups, or standing alone in open fields. For the settlers breaking that land, they were an immediate and practical obstacle. And when the mounds were opened, whether out of curiosity, for construction purposes, or simply in the course of clearing, they revealed their contents. Those contents varied. Some mounds contained artifacts, tools, pottery, ornamental objects, items made from materials that had been traded across considerable distances. Others contained human remains, sometimes in significant quantities, sometimes arranged in ways that suggested deliberate ceremony or deliberate placement. The remains were, in many cases, old, centuries old, and in some instances older than that. The individuals buried in these mounds had lived and died long before European contact with the continent. Their physical remains had been in the ground for a very long time, by the time they were encountered by 19th century settlers. The people who built these mounds are referred to in historical scholarship as the mound builders, a broad term that covers a range of distinct cultures spread across a long period of time. These were not a single civilization. They were multiple societies in different regions at different periods, connected by some shared practices, but also distinguished by significant differences in their traditions, their social organization, and their relationships to the land. The earthworks they left behind are now recognized as genuine achievements of engineering and planning, structures that required organized labor, sustained effort, and accumulated knowledge about the landscape and its materials. But this is where the historical context becomes complicated, because in the 19th century, that recognition did not yet exist in any widespread or established form. Many of the settlers who encountered the mounds, and many of the writers, editors, and readers who followed the account of those encounters, did not interpret them as the work of indigenous peoples at all. In fact, a significant portion of the educated public at that time actively resisted that interpretation. The resistance was not entirely random. It drew on a combination of cultural assumptions, racial attitudes, and genuine ignorance about the history of the continent that shaped how people in that era processed new information. The prevailing view among a large segment of population was that the indigenous peoples they were encountering, the communities that were being displaced, confined, and in many cases destroyed by the very expansion that was uncovering these mounds, were not capable of having built such structures. The mounds were too large, too organized, too deliberate. They implied a level of social complexity that many settlers were simply unwilling to attribute to the people they saw around them. This created a space for an alternative explanation. If the mounds were not built by indigenous peoples, then who built them? A separate, earlier population was proposed. A population that had existed on the continent before the peoples currently living there. A population that was more advanced, more organized, and, in many of the accounts that circulated during this period, physically larger. The idea of a race of giants as the original inhabitants of the continent was not a fringe belief in the 19th century. It was discussed in newspapers, debated in popular publications, and referenced in ways that suggest it had genuine traction among a meaningful portion of the reading public. At first, this cultural backdrop might seem like a simple explanation for the skeleton reports. If people wanted to believe in giants, they might have been more likely to report finding them, to misidentify what they found, or to exaggerate the measurements of remains that were actually within a normal human range. Belief shapes perception. A person who expects to find something unusual may interpret an ambiguous piece of evidence in the direction of that expectation. That is a real psychological phenomenon, well documented in other historical contexts, and it would be surprising if it had no effect at all on how discoveries in the 1800s were observed and reported. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the influence of cultural belief runs in more than one direction. Yes, a cultural environment that anticipated giants might have produced more reports of giants, but that same cultural environment might also have produced stronger motivation to dismiss, minimize, or avoid seriously investigating any remains that genuinely were outside the normal range. If the idea of giant skeletons was already associated, in professional circles, with popular sensationalism and with beliefs that serious researchers wanted to distance themselves from, then an archaeologist encountering unusual remains might have had institutional reasons to be cautious about how prominently those remains were reported or recorded. This is not a suggestion that that is what happened. It is an observation that the cultural context created incentives that pointed in multiple directions at once. Ordinary people and popular journalists had reasons to be drawn toward the giant narrative. Professionals and institutions had reasons to be skeptical of it. And in that environment, the question of what was actually found in the ground becomes harder to separate from the question of who was doing the finding, who was doing the reporting, and what each of those parties had reason to emphasize or downplay. The role of religious belief in this context is also worth noting, though carefully. Certain interpretations of biblical texts had long included references to ancient peoples of great physical stature. For readers with those interpretive frameworks already in place, a newspaper report about giant skeletal remains was not just an interesting curiosity. It was potentially meaningful evidence bearing on questions they cared about deeply. That audience existed. It was significant in size, and it created a readership with a strong appetite for exactly this kind of report. Whether that appetite influenced what was published and how it was presented is a question that does not have a clean answer, but it is a factor that the historical context makes visible. However, the timeline does not fully match a purely belief-driven explanation for all of the reports. The cultural belief in a giant ancient race was widespread across the country, but the specific reports of skeletal discoveries were not uniformly distributed. They clustered in areas with high concentrations of mound sites, in regions where land disturbance was most intensive, and in periods that corresponded with active settlement and construction activity. That geographic and temporal pattern is more consistent with real physical discoveries, whatever their ultimate nature, than with purely cultural invention, which might be expected to appear more evenly across different regions and periods. What the mound context adds to the overall picture is a plausible physical environment for the discoveries being reported. If people across a wide portion of the continent were routinely encountering burial mounds and their contents during the course of ordinary land work, then the raw material for skeleton reports, actual human remains, in varying states of preservation, encountered by people with no training in anatomy or archaeology, was genuinely abundant. The question is not whether such encounters happened. They clearly did, in large numbers. The question is what was actually being found, and how reliably the people who found it were able to assess what they were looking at. That question connects directly to the earlier point about the absence of professional follow-up. If the mound-related discoveries were numerous, if some of them involved remains that appeared genuinely unusual to the people present, and if the cultural environment of the time made it difficult for professionals to engage seriously with such reports without risking association with popular sensationalism, then a pattern of real discoveries that were never formally examined becomes at least comprehensible, even if it remains unconfirmed. What the background context does, ultimately, is complicate the standard explanation rather than replace it. The cultural beliefs about giants were real, and they created conditions in which exaggerated or invented reports could circulate easily. But those same conditions were also producing real archaeological encounters, in large numbers, across a wide geography, involving people who had neither the training to assess what they found nor the institutional connections to ensure that unusual finds received serious attention. Both of those things were happening at the same time, in the same environment, and in the historical record, they are not easy to separate from one another. Whether or not that separation is possible, whether the real encounters can be distinguished from the embellished ones at this remove in time, is a question that the existing evidence does not fully answer. What it does answer, at least in part, is why the reports appeared when and where they did. The soil was being opened. The mounds were being encountered. The cultural moment was primed for a particular kind of story. And in that combination of physical reality and interpretive expectation, the reports found the conditions they needed to appear, to spread, and to leave the kind of incomplete record that continues to resist a simple explanation. At first glance, the volume of newspaper reports about giant skeletal remains seems like it should carry real weight. These were not a handful of isolated accounts from a single region or a single decade. They appeared across multiple states, in papers of different sizes and different readerships, over a span of years that stretched well into the latter half of the 19th century. When evidence appears that consistently, across that many independent sources, the natural inclination is to take it seriously. Repetition, in most investigative contexts, is a signal worth paying attention to, and for a long time, that repetition was treated as exactly that, as collective confirmation that something real and significant had been found. But collective repetition only functions as evidence if the accounts genuinely are independent of one another. That is the first condition that needs to be examined. And when researchers began looking more closely at the individual reports, not just cataloging their existence, but comparing their specific language, their structural details, and the patterns in how they were written, something began to emerge that complicated the simple interpretation. The accounts were not as distinct from one another as their geographic spread might have suggested. Some of them were not distinct at all. The practice of reprinting content between newspapers was standard in 19th century American journalism. It was not considered plagiarism in the way it would be today. A smaller regional paper with limited resources would routinely take a story from a larger publication, reprint it with minor changes, and present it to its own readership. This happened with general news, with features, and with curiosity pieces, which is the category these skeleton reports would most naturally have fallen into. A report about unusual bones found during a construction project or a farm excavation was exactly the kind of story that traveled between papers. It was local enough to feel grounded, unusual enough to attract attention, and short enough to fill space, without demanding too much editorial investment. This practice, on its own, does not invalidate the reports. If a genuine discovery was made in one location, and that report was reprinted in 20 different papers, the reprinting does not change the nature of the original discovery. 20 versions of the same true story are still pointing at one real event, but the reprinting practice does complicate the counting. If the same account appeared in multiple papers and is later cataloged as multiple separate reports, the apparent volume of evidence is inflated. What looks like 20 independent confirmations might actually be one account and 19 copies. That distinction matters considerably when assessing how strong the overall pattern of evidence actually is. What makes this more than just a technical problem is what researchers began to find when they compared certain reports in detail. Some accounts did not merely resemble each other in the way that reprints naturally would. They used language that was nearly identical across reports that were supposedly describing different discoveries in different locations. The names of the locations changed. The names of the people involved changed. But the descriptions of the remains, the specific language about the dimensions, the condition of the bones, the circumstances of the discovery, were close enough that the resemblance was difficult to attribute to coincidence or to the natural conventions of the period's journalistic style. This raises questions that do not have easy answers. Were reporters borrowing from each other's phrasing when describing something they had actually seen? Or were some of these reports constructed from an existing template, with local details substituted in to give the account the appearance of a new, independent discovery? The template possibility is not a comfortable one to sit with, because it implies something more deliberate than simple error or exaggeration. If reports were being generated from a recycled framework, rather than from actual observations, that would point toward fabrication, not necessarily widespread conspiracy, but something more like a journalistic convention for a certain type of story, in which the expected shape of the account was partly predetermined. That kind of pattern has been documented in other categories of 19th century newspaper content. Stories about unusual weather events, about encounters with unfamiliar animals, about strange occurrences in remote locations. All of these followed recognizable formats that sometimes ran ahead of the actual evidence they were supposed to be describing. Whether the giant skeleton reports belong in that category, or whether the similarities in language reflect something more innocent, is a question that the existing evidence does not cleanly resolve. Then there's the question of what happened to the remains themselves. A number of the reports, not all of them, but a significant portion, included details about what was done with the bones after they were found. In some accounts, the remains were described as having been donated to a local museum, a historical society, or a university. These were the kinds of institutions that would have been the natural repository for unusual archaeological finds at the time, and including that detail in a report would have added a layer of credibility. It implied that someone with institutional authority had taken the discovery seriously enough to preserve it. It suggested that the evidence was not simply lost or discarded, but was being held somewhere, available in principle for future examination. But when researchers later attempted to follow up on those institutional claims, contacting the museums, historical societies, and universities mentioned or implied in the original reports, they consistently found that no record of the relevant donations could be located. The bones were not in the collections. There were no intake records, no correspondence about the transfer, no catalog entries, no internal references to the discovery. The institutions had, in effect, no memory of the things that the reports claimed had been given to them. That absence is genuinely ambiguous, and it is worth being precise about why. The record-keeping practices of small regional institutions in the 19th century were often poor by the standards that would apply to a modern archive. Collections were maintained inconsistently. Materials were lost, transferred, or destroyed over time without documentation. A genuine donation that arrived at a small historical society in the 1870s or 1880s might well have left no surviving paper trail, even if the object itself was real and the transfer genuinely occurred. The absence of a record, in that context, is not proof that the donation never happened. It is evidence of a gap, and gaps in 19th century institutional archives are not unusual. But this is where it becomes unclear. If the absence of records is consistent with both real donations and fabricated ones, then it cannot, on its own, be used to distinguish between the two possibilities. What the institutional silence does is remove one potential layer of confirmation. The report suggested that evidence had been preserved and deposited somewhere accessible. If that evidence cannot be located, it means the chain of verifiable documentation ends at the newspaper account itself. And a newspaper account in isolation, without any supporting documentation, is a significantly weaker form of evidence than one that connects to a preserved physical record. The photographic question adds another layer of difficulty. By the middle of the 19th century, cameras existed and were being used for documentary purposes. Significant events, public figures, and archaeological discoveries from that era were sometimes photographed, and those photographs have survived. There is a visual record of the period. It is incomplete, certainly, and taking a photograph was not yet the casual act it would later become. but for a discovery of genuine historical significance. Remains of unusual size that were drawing public attention and being discussed in newspapers. The absence of any verified photographic documentation is a detail that does not fully make sense. A small number of images have circulated over the years that were claimed to show these giant skeletal remains. They attracted considerable attention when they appeared, but each of the more prominent ones has been examined and found to be either a digitally altered fabrication, an image created or modified well after the 19th century, or a misidentification of an unrelated object or photograph. None of the circulating images has withstood scrutiny as a genuine period photograph of the discoveries being described in the reports. That does not mean that photographs never existed. Photographs can be lost just as physical objects can be lost, but it does mean that the visual record, which might have provided a different kind of confirmation, is currently absent in any verified form. The combination of these three problems, the template-like similarities in language, the missing institutional records, and the absence of photographic evidence, does not individually constitute a refutation of the reports. Each problem has an explanation that is consistent with the discoveries having been genuine. Journalistic language conventions could explain the similarities. Poor archival practices could explain the missing records. The general scarcity of period photography could explain the absence of images. None of these gaps is impossible to account for in a framework where the discoveries were real. But that detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Each individual explanation is plausible. What becomes harder to maintain is the idea that all of these gaps are the result of innocent, coincidental factors operating simultaneously. When multiple independent problems each require a charitable interpretation in order to keep the overall picture coherent, the cumulative weight of those problems begins to shift the balance of probability. Even without any single piece of definitive contrary evidence, the reports are not disproven by these inconsistencies, but they are made substantially more difficult to evaluate than they initially appeared. There's also the matter of what was not reported. If large-scale mound excavations were routinely producing skeletal remains of unusual size, one might expect the pattern of reporting to reflect that, to include not just the initial discovery reports, but follow-up coverage, disputes between observers, letters from readers who had witnessed similar finds, editorial commentary, and eventually some sustained institutional engagement. What actually appears in the historical record is mostly the initial report, followed by silence. The story appears, draws some attention, and then disappears without resolution. That pattern is more consistent with a curiosity item filling space than with a genuine discovery being taken seriously. And yet the reports keep appearing. They are numerous enough and geographically distributed enough that dismissing them entirely also requires an explanation. Something was generating these accounts. Whether that something was a widespread pattern of real discoveries that were poorly documented and then lost, or a cultural appetite for a particular kind of story that was being fed by a press willing to supply it, or some combination of both. That question remains genuinely open. The inconsistencies that begin to emerge under closer examination do not close it. They make it harder to answer, and that difficulty is not incidental to the historical puzzle here. It is, in many ways, the center of it. Among all the elements that appear in this broader story, one draws attention more consistently than the others. It is not a single discovery, or a single report, or a single gap in the evidence. It is an institution, and the institution in question is not a small regional historical society with incomplete records and limited resources. It is one of the largest and most systematically organized research bodies in the history of the United States. Understanding why that institution keeps appearing in the story, and what its presence or absence in the record actually means, requires looking at what the institution was, what it did, and how it operated during the period when these discoveries were being reported. The Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846. Its founding came at a particular moment in American history, a moment when the country was expanding rapidly, when the physical landscape was being opened and examined on a scale that had no real precedent, and when the question of what had existed on the continent before European arrival was a subject of genuine and widespread public interest. From the beginning, the Smithsonian positioned itself as the central authority on exactly those kinds of questions. It collected objects. It funded research. It sent representatives into the field to document and recover significant finds. And it built, over the decades that followed, one of the largest archival and physical collections in the world. By the latter half of the 19th century, if something important was discovered anywhere in the United States, particularly something with archaeological or natural historical significance, the expectation was that the Smithsonian would eventually be involved. That context matters because of how directly it connects to the skeleton reports. A number of the newspaper accounts from the period do not merely describe the discovery of unusual remains and leave it there. They go further. Some of them specifically state that the remains were forwarded to the Smithsonian, or that individuals identified as Smithsonian representatives were present at or involved in particular excavations. These references were not vague or offhand. In several cases, they were presented as a form of validation, the involvement of the Smithsonian being offered as evidence that the discovery was being taken seriously by the established scientific community. The institution's name, in that context, was functioning as a credential. It was meant to make the report more credible, not less. If those references were accurate, then the logical expectation is clear. An institution of the Smithsonian scale and organizational ambition would have kept records. It would have logged incoming materials, documented the circumstances of acquisition, recorded correspondence with the individuals or groups involved in the original discovery. These were not practices that the Smithsonian adopted late. Record-keeping and systematic documentation were central to its mission from an early stage. For an item of genuine significance, remains of unusual size, connected to the mound sites that the Smithsonian was actively investigating, some form of internal documentation would be the expected outcome, even accounting for the imperfect standards of the period. The Smithsonian's response to inquiries about these specific remains has been consistent. No such records exist. There are no intake logs for the items described. There are no correspondence files connecting the institution to the specific discoveries mentioned in the reports. There are no internal references in the archival material that has been examined to the kinds of remains the newspaper accounts described. On the surface, that answer is clear. The absence of a record from an institution that kept records would seem to indicate that the items were never received. And for many researchers, that institutional silence has been treated as effectively settling the question. If the Smithsonian has no record of it, the reasoning goes, then it probably did not happen. But this is where the explanation starts to weaken, because the same institution whose silence is being used as evidence of absence also had, during the relevant period, archiving practices that were considerably less consistent than its later reputation might suggest. The Smithsonian in the second half of the 19th century was not the fully systematized organization it would eventually become. It was growing rapidly, taking on new areas of responsibility, managing an expanding volume of incoming materials, and doing all of this with resources and staff that were not always proportionate to the scale of what it was attempting to document. Items were sometimes received in the field and transported back to Washington without the kind of formal intake process that would generate a clear paper trail. Acquisitions made during expeditions were not always logged at the point of collection, and the transfer of records from field notes to official institutional documentation was not a process that happened uniformly or reliably. This does not mean that records were deliberately kept incomplete. Institutional disorganization is not the same as institutional concealment, but it does mean that the absence of a record, in this specific institutional context and during this specific period, carries a different weight than it might in a more fully systematized archive. An undocumented item is not the same as a non-existent one. That distinction is not a minor technical point. It is the foundation of the interpretive problem that this part of the story creates. The Smithsonian silence can be read as confirmation that nothing was received. It can also be read as a gap in the record of an institution that, during that period, had gaps. Both readings are available. Neither can be ruled out with certainty based on the existing documentation alone. There's also the matter of institutional reorganization. The Smithsonian went through periods of significant internal restructuring during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Collections were moved, reclassified, consolidated, or in some cases disposed of as the institution's priorities shifted and its physical space was reorganized. Materials that had been held in one part of the collection could be transferred to another without generating clear documentation of the movement. Objects that were considered of lower priority, or that did not fit cleanly into the emerging classification systems of the period, might be handled less carefully than items that were seen as centrally significant. Whether human remains that arrived with uncertain provenance and incomplete documentation would have received careful, systematic handling is a question that the institutional history of that period leaves genuinely open. Some researchers who have examined this aspect of the story point to a specific period of reorganization in the late 19th century as a moment when the integrity of certain parts of the record may have been compromised. They are careful, for the most part, not to make strong claims about what that means. The argument is not that materials were deliberately destroyed or that records were intentionally removed. It is the narrower point that if an item was received during a period of institutional flux, without complete documentation, and was later involved in a reorganization process that also lacked complete documentation, the outcome could be an absence of any trace in the current archive, without that absence necessarily meaning the item was never there. That is a more limited claim than the stronger theories that sometimes circulate about this subject. But it is also a claim that is harder to dismiss, because it rests on things that are actually known about how institutions manage materials over time. At first, this line of reasoning seems like it might simply be a way of keeping the mystery open by making every form of negative evidence ambiguous. And that is a fair concern. If the absence of a record can always be explained by appealing to incomplete archiving practices, then the absence of a record can never be used to conclude anything, which makes the argument unfalsifiable in a way that should be treated with caution. That concern is worth sitting with. It is a genuine methodological problem in this part of the discussion. However, the concern cuts in more than one direction. The same standard of evidence that would require us to treat the absence of Smithsonian records as inconclusive also requires us to treat the original newspaper accounts as inconclusive. Neither the reports nor the institutional silence is strong enough, on its own, to settle the question in either direction. What the Smithsonian dimension adds is not resolution. It adds a layer of institutional complexity that the simpler explanations, either everything was real or everything was invented, do not fully account for. The question is not just whether the discoveries happened. It is also how an institution of that scale and centrality to American archaeology in that period relates to the existing record, and why the relationship between the reports and the institutional archive is as unclear as it is. That unclarity is not, it should be noted, unique to this subject. The broader history of how indigenous remains were handled by American institutions in the 19th century is a history of inconsistent practice, incomplete documentation, and in some cases deliberate misclassification. Human remains from burial mounds were collected in large numbers during that period. They were not always cataloged with care. They were not always held permanently. They moved between institutions, between private collections, and in some cases out of any traceable record entirely. The specific question of whether unusual or anomalous remains receive different handling than typical ones is a question that the existing institutional record is not well positioned to answer, precisely because the overall record of how remains were handled is itself incomplete. This does not make the giant skeleton reports more credible. It also does not make them less credible. What it does is make the Smithsonian silence a less decisive piece of evidence than it initially appeared to be. When a major institution says it has no record of something, that statement draws on the assumption that the institution's records are sufficiently complete to make the absence meaningful. In this case, that assumption is not fully warranted. The records exist, but they are not complete. The practices were systematic, but not uniformly so. And the period in question was one in which the institution was still developing the organizational structures that would eventually make its archive the resource it later became. None of this proves that anything was hidden or deliberately suppressed. That interpretation requires a degree of intentionality and coordination that the existing evidence does not support. What the evidence does support is something more modest, that the Smithsonian's involvement in the story of these discoveries cannot be cleanly confirmed and cannot be cleanly denied on the basis of the current archival record. The institution's name appears in the reports. Its records do not confirm the connection. And the space between those two facts, the gap between what was claimed and what can be verified, remains one of the more persistent and unresolved aspects of the overall picture. Whether that gap will ever be closed, and whether closing it would change the interpretation of the reports in any fundamental way, is not a question that the current state of research is in a position to answer. The Smithsonian's archive is large, and not all of it has been examined in the specific context of this question. What has been examined has not produced confirmation, but the examination has not been exhaustive, and in a collection of that scale, assembled over more than a century and a half, the distance between an absence of evidence and evidence of absence is a distance that has not yet been fully traveled. There is a particular kind of problem that emerges when you stop looking at individual pieces of evidence and start looking at the collection as a whole. Individual accounts can be evaluated on their own terms, the specific details, the source, the circumstances, the plausibility of what is being described. That kind of case-by-case examination is useful, and it is a necessary part of any serious investigation into a body of historical claims. But it has a limitation. It can miss things that only become visible when you step back and look at the broader shape of the evidence. And in this case, when that step back is taken, something becomes visible that the individual accounts do not fully prepare you for. The reports about giant skeletal remains do not just share surface similarities in their language or their general subject matter. They share a structural pattern, a pattern in how the story unfolds from beginning to end, not in every account, and not with perfect consistency, but with enough regularity across enough different cases, in enough different states and decades, that the repetition itself becomes a feature of the record that requires explanation. Understanding what that pattern looks like, and what it might mean, is one of the more difficult interpretive tasks that this body of evidence presents. The pattern begins the same way in case after case. A discovery is made. It is made in the course of ordinary activity, construction, farming, the opening of a burial mound, the excavation of a foundation. The people present are not archaeologists or trained researchers. They are workers, landowners, or curious observers who happen to be at the right location when the ground was opened. What they find, or what the account claims they find, is described as unusual. Bones of significant size, remains that appear to belong to individuals considerably larger than any person those present had encountered. The initial response is excitement, or at minimum a strong sense that what has been found is worth reporting. That excitement generates the next stage of the pattern. The discovery is written up. A local newspaper publishes the account. Sometimes it is brief, a paragraph or two, a note in the local news column. Sometimes it is longer, with more detail about the measurements of the remains, the depth at which they were found, the condition of the surrounding soil, or any artifacts present nearby. The account may be picked up by other papers. It may travel some distance from the original location before the wave of attention reaches its natural limit. For a brief period, the discovery exists in the public record as something that happened, that was observed, that was considered significant enough to report, and then the trail ends. Not gradually, not with a follow-up investigation that produces inconclusive results, not with a formal examination that raises more questions than it answers. The trail simply stops. The next stage of any genuine archaeological discovery, the formal documentation, the scientific follow-up, the institutional engagement, does not appear. What the newspaper published is what the record contains. Beyond that, there is silence. This pattern repeats. It repeats in Ohio. It repeats in Illinois. It repeats in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in Tennessee, and across other states where mound sites were concentrated and land disturbance was intensive during the settlement period. The geography changes. The specific details change. The decades change. But the shape of the story, discovery, local attention, publication, disappearance, remains recognizable across a wide range of individual accounts. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A pattern that appears once might reflect a single unusual circumstance. A pattern that appears across different regions, different time periods, and different social contexts is something that calls for a different kind of explanation. The explanations that are offered for what happened to the remains after the newspaper accounts take a few consistent forms. In some reports, the bones are described as extremely fragile. They were intact when first uncovered, or appeared to be, but exposure to open air caused them to deteriorate rapidly. Within hours or days, the account says, they had crumbled or become too fragile to handle. This is archaeologically plausible. Human remains that have been buried for centuries can be in a highly degraded state, and the introduction of air and changes in humidity can accelerate further deterioration. Bones that appeared solid when first exposed have, in documented cases, become unworkable within a short time. The explanation fits within the range of things that genuinely can happen to old remains. But this is where it becomes unclear. The fragility explanation appears often enough across the accounts that its frequency is itself a question worth raising. In the broader archaeological record of the same period, other types of remains, pottery, tools, organic materials, were sometimes preserved from mound sites with care and transported successfully to institutions for study. The claim that the skeletal remains specifically, in case after case, deteriorated too quickly for any follow-up examination to take place is not impossible, but its repetition across the accounts gives it the quality of a stock explanation rather than an observed outcome, whether it reflects something that actually happened or something that was added to the account because it provided a convenient reason for why no further evidence was available, is a question that cannot be answered from the reports alone. A second explanation that appears regularly is reburial. The remains, some accounts say, were reinterred out of respect for the individuals to whom they had belonged, or simply because reburying them was the most practical course of action once the immediate interest had passed. This is also plausible as a general practice. The treatment of human remains, including the decision to rebury rather than preserve, is something that happened in the 19th century in various contexts. It is not an inherently suspicious explanation, but like the fragility explanation, its appearance as the stated outcome in multiple accounts across multiple locations creates a pattern that raises questions. If remains were consistently reburied, that reburial consistently occurred before any formal scientific examination could take place. The outcome, whatever the reason behind it, was the same. No physical evidence available for later study. The third explanation involves transfer to a person or institution that can no longer be traced. The remains were given to a collector, a landowner, a local official, or sent to an institution whose records are incomplete or no longer accessible. This explanation has already been examined in relation to the Smithsonian, but it appears in a wider range of accounts than those involving that institution specifically. In each case, the chain of custody ends at a point where verification becomes impossible. The item was transferred. Where it went after that is unknown. The transfer itself may have been real, but the effect is the same as the other explanations. The physical evidence, whatever its nature, is no longer available. What is notable is not that any one of these explanations is implausible. Each of them, individually, is a reasonable account of what might happen to fragile, poorly documented remains encountered by untrained people during a period of limited archaeological infrastructure. The problem is that all three explanations, across all the cases where they appear, point in the same direction. They all result in the same outcome. No physical evidence remains. No follow-up examination was possible. The record ends with a newspaper account and goes no further. When a wide range of different explanations all converge on the same result, the permanent unavailability of any verifiable physical evidence, that convergence is something that researchers on both sides of this debate have found difficult to fully account for. Skeptics who have examined this pattern have a framework for it that does not require anything unusual to explain the outcome. In a pre-digital era, they argue, a story about a strange discovery would spread through the press, generate brief attention, and then fade without follow-up simply because follow-up was not how that kind of journalism worked. Curiosity items were published because they were interesting, not because they were verified. The lack of follow-up reflects the norms of the press at the time, not anything significant about the discoveries themselves. The repetition of the pattern reflects the way that a particular type of story spread and then died in 19th century media, a pattern that has parallels in other categories of popular curiosity reporting from the same period. Some believe this explanation accounts for most of what is observed. Others disagree. Those who disagree point to a specific feature of the pattern that the journalistic norms explanation does not fully address. It is not just that follow-up was absent. It is that the absence was consistent even in cases where the reported discovery was significant enough to have attracted the attention of researchers who were actively working in the relevant field. Mound archaeology was a genuine area of study during this period. There were individuals whose professional focus was on exactly the kinds of sites where these discoveries were reportedly being made. The reports were being published in papers that those individuals would have had access to, and yet the scientific follow-up that might be expected, given that context, does not appear in the record. That absence is harder to explain purely through the conventions of popular journalism. It points towards something in the relationship between the reports and the professional research community, a gap between what was being published for a general readership and what was being seriously investigated by people with the training to assess it. Whether that gap reflects a deliberate decision by researchers to avoid engaging with accounts that were already associated with popular sensationalism or something else entirely is not clear from the existing record, but the gap is there, and its consistency across the decades during which these reports appeared is one of the more difficult features of the overall pattern to explain. However, the timeline does not fully match a single clean explanation in either direction. If the pattern were entirely the result of journalistic invention and cultural appetite, one might expect it to fade as the cultural moment that generated it passed. The appetite for stories about a race of giant ancient inhabitants was a feature of a particular period and a particular set of cultural beliefs. As professional archaeology developed and the understanding of the mound builders became more grounded in actual research, that cultural belief lost much of its public traction. And yet the pattern in the reports, discovery, attention, disappearance, persisted across a span of time that outlasted the peak of the cultural belief that supposedly generated it. That persistence is not impossible to explain, but it does suggest that the journalistic convention explanation alone may not be sufficient. What the pattern leaves behind is not a conclusion. It leaves a question that remains open at both ends. The repetition is real. It appears in the record across enough cases and enough geography to require explanation. The explanations that are available each account for part of what is observed, but none of them accounts for all of it. And the feature that none of them fully explains, the consistent, total disappearance of any physical evidence across every case, without exception, is the feature that continues to keep the pattern from being either confirmed or dismissed as simply as the simpler readings of it would suggest. At a certain point in examining this subject, the boundaries of the original question begin to shift. What starts as an investigation into a set of 19th-century American newspaper reports gradually reveals connections that extend well beyond those reports, beyond that country, beyond that century, and beyond the specific cultural moment that produced the accounts being examined. This expansion does not make the original question easier to answer. It makes it considerably more complicated. But it is an expansion that the evidence itself seems to demand, because the pattern that appears in the American reports is not, it turns out, an isolated phenomenon. The reports of unusually large skeletal remains were not unique to the United States. Similar accounts appeared in other parts of the world during roughly the same general period, and in some cases well before it. Publications in parts of Europe carried reports of discoveries that described remains of unusual size, found in circumstances that echoed the American accounts in their general shape. A discovery made during construction or agricultural work, a brief period of local attention, and then a trail that faded before any formal scientific examination could take place. South America produced accounts of a similar character. Reports from the Pacific Islands described remains or traditions associated with people of exceptional physical stature. The geography of these accounts is wide enough that it cannot be contained within any single national or regional history. This global distribution raises questions that the American-focused explanation does not fully address. If the reports were simply the product of 19th-century American journalistic culture, an appetite for curiosity items, a cultural belief in a race of giant ancient inhabitants, and a press willing to supply stories that fed that appetite, then the appearance of similar accounts in regions with entirely different journalistic cultures, different cultural beliefs, and different historical contexts becomes difficult to account for. The American explanation works reasonably well for the American reports. It is less clear how far it extends, when the same basic pattern appears on other continents, in other languages, under other social and institutional conditions. One response to this observation is that the accounts in different regions were not actually independent of one another. The 19th century was a period of substantial global communication, at least among literate and commercially connected societies. Ideas, stories, and narrative frameworks traveled between Europe and the Americas, and between different parts of the colonized world, through trade networks, missionary activity, scientific correspondence, and the international circulation of printed materials. A story type that gained traction in one press culture could migrate to another, carrying its basic template with it. If the giant skeleton report was a recognizable format in American journalism, it may have been recognizable in European journalism for related reasons, without either tradition being truly independent of the other. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the accounts that appear in non-Western contexts, in indigenous oral traditions, in records from cultures that had no direct connection to the European and American press networks of the 19th century, do not fit comfortably into the framework of cross-cultural journalistic borrowing. These traditions were not newspaper reports. They were not products of the same institutional and commercial processes that generated the American accounts. They existed in a different form, transmitted through different means, and rooted in cultural frameworks that developed independently of the Western intellectual tradition that produced the press reports being examined elsewhere. Whatever explains the newspaper accounts does not automatically explain these. The ancient texts present a related but distinct problem. Researchers who have looked at this subject from a broader historical perspective have pointed consistently to a body of written material, Greek, Roman, various religious scriptures, and other ancient sources, that contains references to beings of exceptional physical size. These references are not obscure or marginal. They appear in texts that are central to the literary and religious traditions of major civilizations. The Greek tradition includes accounts of beings of great stature that occupied the world in an earlier age. Roman literature contains similar references, drawing on and extending the Greek material. And various religious texts, read across their different interpretive traditions, contain passages that have been understood by some readers as describing a population of physically large human beings living in a period before the present one. The most frequently cited of these textual references, in the context of this discussion, involves the Nephilim, a term that appears in certain ancient Hebrew texts and has been the subject of interpretive debate for a very long time. Whether the term refers to literal beings of unusual physical size, or whether it functions as a metaphorical or symbolic description of something else entirely, is a question that scholars have approached from multiple directions without arriving at a consensus. The same uncertainty applies to the Greek Titans and to related figures in other mythological traditions. These are not simple factual records of physical discoveries. They are texts that exist within literary and religious frameworks that have their own conventions, their own symbolic registers, and their own relationships to historical reality, relationships that are not always straightforward to interpret. Some believe that these ancient textual references preserve a genuine cultural memory of something real, that they reflect, however imperfectly and however filtered through later literary and religious elaboration, an actual historical population that was distinguished by unusual physical characteristics. Others disagree. The more widely held view in academic scholarship is that stories of giants are a near-universal feature of human mythology, appearing across cultures that have no historical connection to one another, and that their universality reflects something about human storytelling and cultural imagination rather than something about actual historical populations. On this view, the fact that giants appear in Greek myth, in the Hebrew scriptures, in indigenous oral traditions, and in the folklore of cultures on every inhabited continent is itself evidence that the giant figure is a product of human narrative instinct, not a physical reality. That argument is reasonable, and it draws on a genuine pattern. The giant does appear in some form, in an extraordinary range of human cultural traditions. Mythology scholars have noted this for a long time, and the cross-cultural prevalence of the figure is well documented. But the argument from universality has a limit. The fact that a story type appears across many cultures does not, on its own, establish that the story has no basis in physical reality. Other story types that appear across many cultures, Accounts of catastrophic floods, for instance, have been found to correspond, in at least some cases, to real geological or climatic events, even though the story as told is clearly shaped by narrative and symbolic convention rather than direct documentary recording. The existence of a story in many places does not prove it is real, but it does not automatically prove it is invented either. This is where the relationship between mythology and physical evidence becomes relevant, and also where it becomes most difficult to evaluate. If mythological traditions across multiple cultures preserve some form of memory of real beings of unusual size, then the physical evidence for those beings should, in principle, exist somewhere in the archaeological record. That is the connection that researchers who argue for a literal interpretation of the giant traditions are pointing toward when they cite the American skeleton reports. The argument is not merely that the newspaper accounts are credible on their own terms. It is that those accounts, if real, would represent the physical evidence that the mythological traditions have always implied but never directly confirmed. But this is also where the argument encounters its most significant problem. The connection between the mythological traditions and the physical evidence being claimed in the newspaper reports is entirely unproven. Pointing to the existence of giant figures in ancient texts and then pointing to 19th century discovery reports does not establish a link between the two. It places them in proximity. It suggests a possible connection. But suggestion is not evidence. For the connection to be meaningful, something more than parallel existence in the historical record would be required. Physical remains that could be independently examined, measured, and compared to what is described in both the ancient texts and the newspaper accounts would be the minimum necessary to begin making that case. And that physical evidence is precisely what is absent. However, the absence of confirmed physical evidence does not automatically resolve the question of the textual and mythological traditions. Those traditions exist independently of the newspaper reports. Their existence does not depend on whether the American discoveries were real. The Greek texts are not made more or less reliable by what 19th century settlers did or did not find in Ohio. The ancient sources have their own history, their own interpretive challenges, and their own relationship to historical reality that is separate from the American story. Treating them as simply background noise, as cultural mythology that has no bearing on questions of physical history, may be as much of an overcorrection as treating them as direct historical evidence. What the global dimension of this subject introduces is a set of questions that the American-focused version of the investigation does not raise. Why do traditions describing beings of unusual size appear across cultures, with no contact with one another? What relationship, if any, exists between the mythological figure of the giant and actual human physical variation across different populations and time periods? And why did the 19th century, specifically, produce such a concentrated burst of discovery reports in a context where the cultural and religious traditions that might have motivated such reports were particularly active? None of these questions has a clean answer. Each of them points in a different direction, and following any one of them leads into areas where the evidence becomes thinner and the interpretive challenges become greater. The expansion of the question to a global scale does not make the original American reports more credible. It does not confirm that the discoveries were real, or that the remains described were what the accounts claimed. What it does is place the American reports within a much larger context, a context in which the question of whether human beings of unusual size existed at some point in the past is not simply a matter of evaluating a set of newspaper stories, but of engaging with a much older, much wider, and considerably more complicated body of human testimony. Whether that testimony, in any of its forms, connects to physical reality is a question that the existing evidence, taken as a whole, has not answered, and the difficulty of answering it does not diminish with the expansion of the frame. In some ways, it increases. When a body of historical evidence resists a single clean explanation, the natural response is to look for alternative frameworks, not to replace the original question, but to approach it from a different angle, to ask whether the evidence might fit a different interpretation than the ones that have already been considered. In the case of the giant skeleton reports, several alternative interpretations have been proposed over the years. They come from different directions, they draw on different areas of knowledge, and they reach different conclusions about what the reports actually represent. None of them has achieved universal acceptance. Each of them addresses part of the problem, and understanding why none of them fully closes the question is itself an important part of understanding how complicated the evidence actually is. The first alternative interpretation begins with medicine rather than history or journalism. It starts from the observation that human beings of genuinely extraordinary physical size have existed throughout recorded history, and that the biological mechanism behind such cases is well understood. The condition is called gigantism. It results from an excess of growth hormone, typically caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland that develops before the growth plates in the bones have closed. The effect is continued and sometimes dramatic bone growth beyond the normal range. Individuals with this condition can reach heights that are genuinely remarkable. Cases have been documented of individuals reaching 7 feet, and in rare instances approaching or exceeding 8 feet in height. These are real people with documented medical histories, whose physical remains would, if discovered centuries later by someone without medical training, look exactly like what the newspaper reports described. This explanation has genuine scientific grounding. It does not require any unusual assumptions about human prehistory. It does not invoke hidden populations or lost civilizations. It simply points to a known medical reality and asks whether that reality might account for at least some portion of what the discovery reports were describing. An individual of 7 or 8 feet in height, buried in a mound site and discovered centuries later, would produce skeletal remains that an untrained observer could reasonably describe in the language that appears in the newspaper accounts. The bones would be proportionally larger than what those observers were accustomed to seeing. The description of a giant would not be an exaggeration so much as a non-medical observer's honest response to something genuinely outside their experience. But this is where it becomes unclear. The medical explanation works reasonably well for reports describing a single set of remains, one individual, found alone or in a small context, whose unusual size is noted and reported. It does not work as easily for a different category of account, and that category appears in the reports often enough to be significant. Some of the accounts do not describe a single individual. They describe multiple remains, burial sites where several or many individuals, all of unusual size, were reportedly found together. A medical condition affecting an individual's growth hormone production does not translate into a population-level pattern. Gigantism is not a condition that would produce entire communities of unusually large people. If the reports of multiple oversized individuals at single sites are accurate, the medical explanation does not account for them. And if those reports are inaccurate, exaggerated, or invented, then the question becomes why that specific type of exaggeration appears across multiple independent accounts in multiple locations. The second alternative interpretation moves in a very different direction. It is less a scientific explanation than a historical argument, and it concerns not what was found, but what was done with what was found afterward. This theory proposes that the evidence for giant skeletal remains was real, that it was collected and brought to institutional attention, and that it was subsequently suppressed, deliberately removed from the accessible record by institutions, including the Smithsonian, that had reasons to prevent it from becoming part of the established understanding of human prehistory in North America. The argument is that the absence of physical evidence today is not because the evidence never existed, but because it was actively eliminated. This interpretation circulates widely in popular discussions of the subject. It draws on the genuine institutional gaps that have already been noted, the incomplete records, the undocumented acquisitions, the periods of reorganization that may have affected the integrity of certain parts of the archive, and it points to those gaps not as innocent products of 19th century institutional limitations, but as evidence of something more deliberate. Some believe that the established scientific community had strong professional and ideological reasons to prevent the existence of an anomalous ancient population from entering the mainstream record, and that the consistent disappearance of physical evidence across so many cases reflects coordinated action rather than coincidence. However, the suppression theory faces a significant problem that its proponents have not fully resolved. A 2004 article published by a satirical news organization described, in convincing journalistic language, a Smithsonian cover-up of giant skeletal remains. The article was not real reporting. It was satire, clearly labeled as such in its original context. but it spread online, was shared widely, and was treated by a substantial number of readers as genuine investigative journalism. The article was eventually cited by people arguing for the suppression theory as evidence of a real pattern, despite the fact that it was a fabrication designed to parody exactly that kind of claim. That episode does not disprove the suppression theory, but it does illustrate one of its central problems. The theory is structured in a way that makes it very difficult to evaluate using standard methods of evidence. If absence of evidence is interpreted as evidence of suppression, and if fabricated reports are cited as confirmation of a real pattern, the theory becomes self-reinforcing in a way that makes it resistant to scrutiny rather than open to it. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A theory that can absorb both real evidence and invented evidence as confirmation of itself, and that treats the absence of supporting records as further proof of concealment, is a theory that has insulated itself from falsification. That does not mean it is wrong. Genuine suppression of inconvenient evidence has happened in various historical contexts, and institutions have, on documented occasions, managed their collections in ways that served their existing theoretical frameworks rather than simply preserving everything impartially. But the structural problem with unfalsifiable arguments applies regardless of the subject, and the suppression theory in this case has not been presented in a form that clearly separates what is being claimed from what would count as evidence against the claim. The third alternative interpretation is in some ways the most methodologically grounded of the three, because it draws directly on documented cases of mistaken identification rather than on either medical conditions or institutional behavior. The proposal is that a significant portion of the giant skeleton reports were based on genuine discoveries of real bones, but bones that did not belong to human beings. The specific example that appears most frequently in this context involves mastodon remains. Mastodons were large prehistoric animals that inhabited North America until their extinction roughly 10,000 years ago. Their bones have been found throughout the same geographic regions where the mound sites are concentrated, and in some cases in similar soil conditions. A large mastodon femur, the thigh bone, is a substantial object. Its general shape, in certain conditions, and to an observer with no training in anatomy or paleontology, could plausibly be mistaken for a human bone of extraordinary size. This kind of misidentification is not hypothetical. It has been documented in the historical record. There are known cases from the 19th century where animal bones were initially interpreted as human remains by the people who found them, and where those interpretations made their way into local reports before any trained examination corrected the error. The mechanisms that would allow such errors to occur were clearly present. Untrained observers, unusual bone sizes, conditions that made careful examination difficult, and a cultural environment that was already primed to interpret unusual bones as evidence of a giant ancient population. The combination of those factors creates real conditions for honest misidentification. But the misidentification theory also has limits. It works best for reports that describe a small number of bones found in isolation, a single femur, a skull fragment, a collection of uncontextualized remains that a non-specialist might assess incorrectly. It is harder to apply to accounts that describe more complete skeletal assemblages, where the overall proportional structure of the remains was observed, or where multiple bones from the same individual were present together in a configuration that would be more difficult to mistake for non-human remains. Additionally, mastodon remains, while present in the same general regions, are not exclusively or even primarily found within burial mounds. The mound context itself implies human activity. Bones found within a constructed burial structure carry a different interpretive presumption than bones found in open soil, and the misidentification theory does not fully address how that context would have been handled. Each of these three interpretations, then, addresses a real part of the problem. The medical explanation accounts for individual cases of genuinely unusual human physical size, and it does so without requiring any assumptions beyond known biology. The suppression theory addresses the consistent disappearance of physical evidence, and it draws on real institutional history, even if its structure makes it difficult to evaluate rigorously. The misidentification theory accounts for honest error by untrained observers, and it draws on documented cases of exactly that kind of error occurring in comparable circumstances. None of these is without foundation, and none of them is without limits. What makes the alternative theories collectively interesting is not that any one of them succeeds in explaining the full range of reports. It is that all three of them are necessary to cover different parts of what the reports describe. The medical explanation covers some cases, but not others. The misidentification theory covers a different subset. The suppression theory is invoked for the cases that neither of the others can account for. The fact that three separate explanations are each needed for different portions of the evidence suggests that the reports are not a uniform category, that different accounts may have different origins, different levels of accuracy, and different relationships to whatever physical reality, if any, they were describing. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If some reports were based on genuine cases of gigantism, and others on honest misidentification of animal bones, and others on journalistic invention, and possibly others on something that none of the proposed theories adequately accounts for, then the category of giant skeleton reports is not a single problem with a single answer. It is a collection of different problems that happen to share a surface similarity. Treating it as a single unified phenomenon, as both its strongest defenders and its strongest critics tend to do, may be part of why the debate has continued for as long as it has without resolution. Researchers continue to disagree on which explanation carries the most weight. Some find the misidentification theory sufficient to account for the great majority of cases. Others consider the medical explanation more central. Those who favor the suppression theory argue that the other two explanations, even combined, leave too much unexplained. And across all three positions, the fundamental problem remains the same. Without physical evidence that can be independently examined, the debate must be conducted entirely on the basis of documentary records that are incomplete, inconsistent, and in some cases of uncertain origin. The theories multiply. The evidence does not. At some point in any serious investigation, it becomes necessary to stop and take stock of where the evidence has actually led, not where it was expected to lead, and not where any particular interpretation would prefer it to end up, but where it has actually arrived after being examined as carefully and as honestly as the available material allows. In this case, that moment has been reached, and the honest answer to the question of where the evidence has led is not a clean one. It is not a confirmation, and it is not a refutation. It is something more difficult to sit within either of those outcomes, a position of genuine, substantiated uncertainty that the evidence itself has produced and that no amount of additional interpretation seems, so far, to have resolved. The starting point of this investigation was a body of historical documents, newspaper reports, published across multiple American states during the 19th century, describing the discovery of human skeletal remains of unusual size. These were not anonymous rumors or undated fragments. Many of them appeared in named publications, in specific issues, on specific dates. Many of them included names, the names of the people who made the discoveries, the names of the locations where the discoveries were made, the names of institutions that were said to have received the remains. Some included measurements. Some included descriptions of the surrounding context, the depth of the burial, the condition of the soil, the presence or absence of associated artifacts. As a body of documentary evidence, they were detailed enough to take seriously. And taking them seriously is what this investigation has attempted to do. What that serious examination has produced is a picture that resists the simple readings available at either end of the interpretive spectrum. The straightforward dismissal that the reports were fabrications generated by a sensationalist press for an audience with an appetite for curiosity items accounts for a real and significant portion of what is observed. The journalistic culture of the period was genuinely capable of producing exactly that kind of content. The cultural conditions that would have made such stories attractive to both publishers and readers were genuinely present. The similarities in language across different accounts, the absence of follow-up coverage, and the pattern of trails that end abruptly after the initial report are all consistent with the fabrication explanation. That explanation is not without foundation, but it does not fully account for everything in the record, and the parts it does not account for are not minor. The scale of the accounts, the sheer number of them, distributed across a wide geography and a long span of time, is larger than what might be expected from purely invented content circulating through a press culture. The specific details that appear in many of the reports, Named individuals, named locations, referenced institutional involvement are the kind of details that, in other historical contexts, are treated as markers of at least partial grounding in real events. The recurring pattern of discovery, followed by disappearance, which appears consistently enough to be a structural feature of the record rather than a coincidence, is something that the simple fabrication explanation has difficulty addressing without additional assumptions. This raises questions that the mainstream explanation leaves open. If the accounts were largely invented, the invention was unusually consistent in its structural features across cases that had no obvious direct connection to one another. If they were largely based on real discoveries that were then exaggerated in the reporting, the exaggeration was remarkably uniform in what it claimed and in how it ended. And if they were a mixture of invention, exaggeration, and genuine observation, which is perhaps the most honest summary of what the evidence suggests, then the mixture has so far resisted being sorted into its component parts in any systematic way. The alternative explanations that have been examined do not resolve this difficulty. The medical explanation, that some reports reflected genuine discoveries of remains belonging to individuals with gigantism, is scientifically grounded and accounts for a subset of cases in a way that requires no unusual assumptions. But it leaves the accounts describing multiple oversized individuals at single sites without an adequate explanation, and it says nothing about the institutional dimension of the story. The misidentification theory, that untrained observers mistook animal bones, including mastodon remains, for human skeletal material, is also grounded in documented historical reality, and it accounts for another subset of cases. But it does not easily extend to accounts where the described context makes simple misidentification less plausible, and it does not address the pattern of disappearance that follows so many of the reports regardless of what was originally found. The suppression theory occupies a different category from the other two. It is not a scientific explanation in the same sense. It is a historical argument about institutional behavior, and while the institutional gaps it points to are real, the incomplete records, the undocumented acquisitions, the periods of reorganization that affected the integrity of certain collections, the theory as it is typically presented has structural problems that make it difficult to evaluate rigorously. An argument that treats absence of evidence as confirmation of concealment, and that absorbs both genuine and fabricated reports as supporting the same conclusion, is an argument that has insulated itself from the kind of scrutiny that would allow it to be either confirmed or disconfirmed. That does not make it false, but it does make it harder to work with as an explanatory framework. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Each of the three alternative theories addresses something real. None of them addresses everything, and the attempt to combine them, to say that some reports reflect gigantism, others reflect misidentification, and others reflect suppression, with the remainder being journalistic invention, produces a picture that is comprehensive in coverage but weak in explanatory power. A framework that can absorb every case by assigning it to a different category is not a framework that has explained the pattern. It has cataloged it. The pattern itself, why these reports appeared when and where they did, why they follow the same structural shape, and why the physical evidence is absent without exception, remains without a single explanation that fits all of its features. What the investigation has also revealed, perhaps more clearly than any single piece of evidence, is how much the question depends on the condition of the record itself. The historical record of the 19th century is not complete. It was never going to be complete. Documents were lost, institutions reorganized, collections moved or disposed of without documentation, and the ordinary entropy of time worked against the preservation of anything that was not considered central enough to protect carefully. That incompleteness is a real feature of the evidentiary landscape, and it creates a genuine problem for any attempt to draw firm conclusions from the existing material. Absence in an incomplete record is not the same as confirmed non-existence, but it is also not confirmation of existence. It is a gap, and the gap has a different meaning depending on what was ever there to begin with, which is precisely what is not known. The institutions most capable of resolving the question have offered responses that not everyone finds complete. The Smithsonian's position that no records of the relevant materials exist in its archive is the kind of institutional statement that would, in most historical contexts, carry significant weight. An institution of that size and organizational ambition saying clearly that no such record exists, is making a meaningful claim. But as the earlier examination of the Smithsonian's archiving practices during the relevant period showed, the weight of that claim depends on assumptions about the completeness of the archive that are not fully warranted. The institution's answer is clear. Whether it is comprehensive is a different question, and it is one that the institution's own internal history makes difficult to answer with confidence. Some believe that the question could still be resolved through new research, unexamined portions of institutional archives, systematic surveys of regional historical society records, or new archaeological work at identified mound sites might produce evidence that shifts the balance in one direction or the other. Others disagree, arguing that if physical evidence of the kind described in the reports existed and has not surfaced after a century and a half of both amateur and professional investigation, the probability of its surfacing now is low enough that waiting for it is not a productive research posture. Neither position is unreasonable. Both reflect genuine uncertainty about what the existing gaps in the record actually mean and what, if anything, might be done to reduce them. However, the timeline does not fully match a picture in which the question is simply waiting for more research to resolve it. The 19th century reports are old. The physical sites where discoveries were claimed have, in most cases, been substantially altered by subsequent construction and land use. The individuals named in the reports are long dead. The institutional records from the relevant period have been through multiple reorganizations. The conditions that would allow a definitive physical resolution of the question, fresh, undisturbed remains, carefully documented and independently examined, are not conditions that are likely to emerge from the existing historical context. The question may remain open not because the answer is being withheld, but because the evidence needed to close it is no longer accessible in the form that would be required. That is not a satisfying position. Investigations are generally expected to produce answers, and an investigation that ends with a carefully documented statement of irreducible uncertainty can feel like a failure of method rather than an honest conclusion. But the alternative, forcing a definitive answer onto evidence that does not support one, would be a different kind of failure. The reports existed. That is confirmed. The bones, if they ever existed in the form the reports described, are not accessible today. That is also confirmed. The reasons for that gap are contested, and the contest has not been resolved by any of the explanations that have been seriously proposed. Whether that gap represents a failure of journalism, a press culture that generated more story than substance and left a trail of unverifiable claims in its wake, or a failure of science, a professional community that did not follow up on discoveries that deserve serious attention, or something that neither of those framings fully captures, is a question that the existing evidence does not answer. Each framing fits part of what is observed. None of them fits all of it. And the most accurate thing that can be said, after examining the record as carefully as the record allows, is that the question remains genuinely open. Not open in the way that unsettled popular mysteries are often described as open, as an invitation to speculation, but open in the more precise sense that the evidence available does not currently support a conclusion that can withstand the full weight of scrutiny applied to it. That is where this investigation has arrived, and that, for now, is where it rests. However, there is another possibility, and it is one that sits in a far more uncomfortable place than either straightforward belief or straightforward fabrication. It is the possibility that the historical record itself behaves differently around certain kinds of discoveries, not because of a coordinated conspiracy operating in secret across generations, but because institutions, cultures, and even individuals have a tendency to filter reality through what they already believe to be possible. Throughout the history of science, there are examples of discoveries that were initially dismissed not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were inconvenient. Ideas that conflicted with established models were often ignored until enough evidence accumulated that ignoring them became impossible. This is not unique to archaeology. It appears in medicine, in astronomy, in geology, in almost every field where existing frameworks determine what researchers expect to find before they begin looking. And expectation matters more than most people realize. If a 19th century laborer uncovered remains that appeared unusually large, the interpretation of those remains would depend heavily on the assumptions carried by the people examining them. A local newspaper editor working in a culture fascinated by ancient giants might describe the discovery in exaggerated terms because that was the narrative already available to him. A professional archaeologist, encountering the same remains decades later in a cultural environment increasingly hostile to sensational claims, might move instinctively in the opposite direction, toward caution, skepticism, or silence. The physical evidence itself may not have changed very much. The interpretive framework surrounding it certainly did. That possibility creates an important distinction. The question may not be whether the reports were entirely true or entirely false. The more difficult question may be whether different groups of people were looking at the same kinds of discoveries and interpreting them in radically different ways, depending on the intellectual climate of their own time. Because the reality is that human height variation has always existed. There have always been individuals who were exceptionally tall. Medical conditions affecting growth are documented throughout recorded history. Skeletal remains from unusually large individuals are not impossible within the normal range of human biology. The archaeological question is not whether tall humans existed. They clearly did. The question is whether the remains being reported represented ordinary variation exaggerated through storytelling, or whether some cases genuinely fell outside what modern researchers would expect to encounter. And this is where the absence of physical evidence becomes more significant than it first appears. If even a small percentage of the reported discoveries were genuine examples of unusually large human remains, then those cases would have had the potential to alter ongoing discussions about ancient populations, migration patterns, nutrition, genetics, and environmental adaptation. Not dramatically, not in a way that would rewrite all of human history, but enough to generate serious scientific interest. Yet no such confirmed body of evidence exists within the accepted archaeological record today. That absence forces the discussion into two possibilities. Either the newspaper reports overwhelmingly reflected exaggeration and misinterpretation, meaning the physical evidence never existed in the form described, or some amount of genuine evidence once existed and was subsequently lost, ignored, misclassified, or allowed to disappear through the ordinary failures of historical preservation. The first explanation is simpler. The second explanation is historically common. Entire archaeological collections have vanished before. Museum archives have burned. Private collections have been discarded after the death of their owners. Excavation notes have been misplaced. Artifacts once considered unimportant have later turned out to be historically significant after surviving examples were rediscovered decades later. The historical record is not a perfectly preserved structure. It is fragmented, uneven, and shaped as much by what survives as by what originally existed. And that creates a strange problem when looking back at the giant skeleton reports. Because the farther modern researchers move away from the 19th century, the harder the claims become to verify, but also the harder they become to conclusively disprove. The people involved are gone. The excavation sites have changed. The local memory surrounding many discoveries disappeared generations ago. In some cases, the only surviving trace is a few inches of newspaper text preserved on aging paper or inside a digital archive, scanned more than 100 years later. That is not enough evidence to prove the existence of an ancient race of giants, but it is enough evidence to prove that something unusual was happening in the historical record. Something was being found, something was being reported, and something about those reports was compelling enough that they continued to appear, again and again, across decades of excavation and expansion. What exactly the people involved believed they were seeing is harder to reconstruct now than it would have been at the moment the ground first opened. And perhaps that is the most important part of this entire story. Not the question of whether giants existed, but the question of how history itself was created. Because history is not simply the collection of everything that happened. It is the collection of what was recorded, what survived, what institutions preserved, and what later generations considered important enough to remember. Every historical narrative contains gaps, missing objects, missing documents, missing voices. Most of the time those gaps are harmless. Sometimes they are not. The giant skeleton reports sit directly inside one of those gaps, too widespread to dismiss casually, too weakly supported to confirm confidently, suspended in a space between folklore, journalism, archaeology, and cultural myth, where none of the available explanations fully settles the matter. And that may ultimately be why the story continues to survive. Not because the evidence is definitive, but because it is incomplete. Incomplete evidence has a particular effect on the human mind. It invites interpretation. It leaves room for suspicion, for imagination, and for competing explanations to exist side by side without either one fully defeating the other. A clean answer closes a subject. Unresolved evidence keeps it alive. More than a century later, the old newspaper pages are still there. The names are still there. The measurements, the excavation accounts, the descriptions of bones lifted from the earth and briefly displayed before disappearing back into silence. All of it remains preserved in fragments scattered across archives and forgotten publications. And somewhere between those fragments and the silence that followed them lies the actual truth of what happened. Whether that truth was ordinary, misunderstood, exaggerated, or genuinely extraordinary is something the surviving record still cannot fully decide. At least not yet.